Welcome to our discussion of the integumentary system, or skin. Our objectives in this chapter will be to explain the functions of the skin and subcutaneous tissue, including associated structures. This will include the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. We'll identify causes of various skin colors, both normal and abnormal. We will discuss the structure and function of hair and nails. We'll differentiate between various subcutaneous glands and outline both superficial and deep wound healing. The skin is our largest organ. It makes up about 7% of our body weight. The thickness is variable, but normally between 1.5 and 4 millimeters thick. The dermis may thicken up to about 6 millimeters. The stratum corneum layer can be increased, causing calluses on our hands and feet, which also causes the thickness to increase. The skin is treated by dermatologists and has 3 major layers. The epidermis is made up of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. The dermis is made up of connective tissue, 2 different types that we'll learn about in lab. And the hypodermis is made up of connective tissue as well. It's primarily adipose tissue. So sometimes we also call this the subcutaneous layer. We'll abbreviate that sub and the letter Q, so you may have seen this if you work in a medical setting. The structure of the skin can be seen here. First, we have our epidermis. So our epidermis has layers, and those layers make up stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and this type of stratified squamous epithelial tissue is keratinized, so that very top layer is a keratinized layer. The skin also has a dermis. The dermis is this layer right here. It's sort of pink in this picture, and the dermis has 2 layers. The papillary layer, which is this area where the dermis kind of invades into the epidermis. So all of these are part of the papillary layer, make up the papilla. And then the reticular layer, which is the deeper layer of the dermis, and that's all of this deeper layer. Finally, we have the hypodermis, which is the subcutaneous tissue. So this is not part of the skin, but it is part of the integumentary system. So this is our hypodermis. You can see it's a fatty subcutaneous layer down there. Now, we have a bunch of things that are included in the integumentary system. We have things like hairs. You can see a hair shaft right here going down into the root of the hair, and this little thing where the hair receives its nutrients is the papilla of the hair. You can see that the hair is connected to these little yellow structures. These are nerve endings. These tell us when the hair is moved. Associated with the hair are sebaceous gland right here. You can see how that's spelled. It's also called an oil gland. We also have sweat glands, and these are a type of gland called eccrine glands, and that just indicates how they produce their product. So this is a sweat gland, and then it has a duct that goes up to the skin to release the sweat at the sweat pore. We have erector pili muscles. So this muscle right here, this is what gives you goosebumps and makes your hair stand on end. Notice that there's a nerve going to that muscle so that our nervous system can tell the muscle when to contract. So erector pili muscle, sometimes you'll also see this as a piloerector muscle. Same muscle, just 2 different versions of the name. The hair follicle, this is the tissue that surrounds the hair and supports the hair. So that's our hair follicle. And then the hair root is the part of the hair that is below the surface of the skin. So this is all hair root right here. And it's surrounded by the follicle, these cells right here. The hair follicle is made up of epidermal cells. So it's epithelial cells that surround that hair follicle. Some other important things to note are the dermal papillae. So these are part of the papillary layer. And you see that they stick up and kind of mesh with the epidermis. So that those are dermal papillae. Adipose tissue is what the hypodermis is primarily composed of. We also have a number of nerve or sensory structures. We have some free nerve endings. You see these here. They're located in the dermal papilla. They deal with light, touch, and temperature. We also have a lamellar corpuscle that deals with slightly deeper touch. And we have hair follicle receptors, which are these that surround the hair follicle and tell you when your hair is moving. We'll talk about a couple of other sensory structures associated with the integumentary system as we discuss the skin in more detail. Notice that the junction between the hypodermis and the dermis has lots of blood vessels in it, so it's very vascular. So this is why you bleed when you cut yourself. These blood vessels get damaged and release their contents. The functions of the skin are to resist trauma and infection. Oftentimes these two things are lumped together into a protection category. Skin is packed with keratin and linked by desmosomes. So the very top layer of our stratified squamous epithelial cells, it's keratinized and it's linked by very strong connections called desmosomes. We also have an acid mantle. The pH of our skin is between 4 and 6, which is slightly lower than the rest of our body. That makes it more acidic. That makes it harder for things like bacteria to grow on it. The skin is also a barrier to ultraviolet light. It protects our multiplying cells from that ultraviolet light and DNA damage. The skin is a barrier to water loss. It's waterproof. It contributes to temperature maintenance and excretion of chemicals. It's a reservoir for blood. All of those blood vessels we saw in the dermis and hypodermis can hold on to extra blood when needed. It contributes to vitamin D synthesis. Vitamin D is important in the absorption of calcium so that we can maintain our bone density. It provides sensory information, and the skin and associated structures like eyebrows are important in nonverbal communication. So in order to make expressions, you need skin and associated structures. The cells that we find in the epidermis, that portion that is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, include keratinocytes. These are going to be most of our skin cells, and the job of these cells is to produce keratin. Keratin is a tough, fibrous protein. We also have melanocytes. These melanocytes synthesize pigment, and this pigment is called melanin. This is what shields us from UV rays. So when we're exposed to lots of UV light from the sun, we have melanocytes that are stimulated to produce more melanin. That melanin gets spread out to our keratinocytes and gives us a tan. That tan color actually protects the cells underneath that layer. We also have tactile cells. Tactile cells are receptor cells that are associated with nerve fibers for sensation. So the tactile structure, tactile disc, is a sensory neuron that is in close proximity to a tactile or Merkel cell. And that together makes up that Merkel disc. So the cell passes on information to the sensory neuron. And finally, we have dendritic cells, which guard against pathogens. That's this big one over here. This is a dendritic cell, and he functions like a Pac-Man. He'll wander around looking for pathogens or invaders, and then he'll munch them up and let the immune system know that they got through the barrier on the outside of the skin. We also have stem cells, which are undifferentiated cells in the deepest layers of the epidermis, which can reproduce and support new cell growth. So the epidermal layers. We have 4 layers in most of our skin, and this skin is called thin or hairy skin. We're not just talking about the hair on our head, but the little tiny hairs that are on most of our skin. We find this thin skin everywhere but the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. This thin skin has 4 layers. Thick skin adds an additional layer. We find this thick skin on the palms and the soles of our feet. So I'll show you where that extra layer is. So going from deep to superficial, we have the stratum basal, which is the deepest layer. We also can call this the germinal layer. So in lab we talk about how this layer is the layer that produces our new cells. So this layer right here is our stratum basal, and it's the germinal layer. The stratum spinosum is the next layer, and it contains cells that have sort of a spiny appearance. You can see some of these spines right here. That's an artifact of histological slide preparation. So as we prepare these slides, they start looking more and more spiny. The stratum granulosum is the next layer. That's this layer right here. So granulosum, spinosum, and this real thin layer here is the basal. So the granulosum is where these cells start to get granules, and you see this darker appearance of these cells due to the staining of those granules. The stratum lucidum is not present in either of these diagrams, but it would be right here if this was thick skin. So this is where it would be, the lucidum. And it's a clear layer, so it's almost, you almost can't see it, and it's because of the fats that are in that layer, and those fats don't stain well, so it looks lucid. Because this is thin skin, the next layer we have is the stratum corneum. This is this whole layer. Sometimes I call this the flaky croissant layer. It looks kind of flaky. These cells are no longer alive. You can see that they don't have nuclei. These cells have very clear nuclei. We lose those nuclei as these cells die because they're cut off from the nutrients by these cells right in this layer here. So our nutrients get cut off. The cells above that are going to be dead in the stratum corneum, and that forms our keratinized layer. So our deepest layer is a single layer of cells right on top of that basement membrane. Remember, the basement membrane is underneath all of our epithelial tissue. So the basement membrane would be right there, and the first layer of cells on top of that are the stratum basal. Cell types in this layer include keratinocytes, which undergo mitosis to replace the epidermis. So these are one of the cells that are able to replicate and regenerate our skin. There's only a couple cell types that can regenerate into cells that are exactly like themselves, as opposed to forming scar tissue. One type is our keratinocytes in the skin. The other type is our hepatocytes in the liver. We also have melanocytes. Melanocytes will be stimulated by UV light to produce melanin, and then they will reach out to their neighboring keratinocytes and distribute that melanin into those keratinocytes. So melanin gets picked up by the keratinocytes, and this is what gives us our skin color and what causes our skin color to darken when we're exposed to the sun. The final type of cell you can find in this layer are the tactile cells. So they're touch receptors, and they form the Merkel disc. So the touch receptor cell plus the nerve that it's attached to form that tactile or Merkel disc. The stratum spinosum contains several layers of keratinocytes, and they're spiny due to the shrinkage during histological preparation. So that means when we make the slides of this tissue. The stratum spinosum contains dendritic cells. So this is going to be our dendritic cell right here. You can see him hanging out among those keratinocytes in the spinosum. These dendritic cells are macrophages. Macrophages are going to be muncher cells. They're kind of like garbage men. They cruise around the body and munch up anything that shouldn't be there. They're white blood cells, so they come from the bone marrow and migrate to the epidermis. And we have approximately 800 of these cells per square millimeter. So there's a lot of these in the skin. They help protect our body by looking for pathogens, breaking down those pathogens, and then presenting them to the immune system. So they'll grab them, take them apart, and then hold them up and say, "Look what I found!" And the immune system then comes over and destroys whatever that pathogen is. The stratum granulosum contains 3 to 5 layers of flat keratinocytes. So notice that these cells right here are flatter than the other cells. They're not quite as poofy. So we start out kind of roundish at the bottom, and we get flatter and flatter as we go up towards the superficial or top layers. The stratum granulosum contains granules of keratinohyalin, and these combine with filaments of the cytoskeleton and result in keratin. The stratum granulosum cells also produce lipid-filled vesicles that release a glycolipid. So this is a carbohydrate-fat combination, and they release that by exocytosis, and this helps to waterproof the skin. So between the keratin and this glycolipid, we form a waterproof barrier between the surface cells and the deeper layers of the skin. This cuts off the surface cells from the nutrient supply. So these cells down here are getting nutrients, but these cells here cut off the nutrient supply. So these cells up here are all dead cells. You notice the lack of nuclei. So the stratum lucidum is a thin translucent zone seen only in thick skin. And you can see that zone right here, that clear zone right here between the stratum granulosum, where we have those darker staining vesicles, and the stratum corneum above that. So we only see the stratum lucidum in thick skin on the palms and the soles of the feet. In this layer, the keratinocytes are packed with elidin, a precursor to keratin. It doesn't stain well, which is why we get that clearish looking layer. The cells have no nuclei or organelles because this stratum granulosum layer has cut off the nutrient supply. And finally, in both types of skin, thick and thin, we see the stratum corneum, and that's this really thick layer. I kind of call it the flaky croissant layer because it looks kind of, the cells look thin and flaky like a croissant. It's up to 30 layers of dead, scaly, keratinized cells. And these are the surface cells that flake off or exfoliate. So when you exfoliate, you're taking off some of those dead surface cells in the stratum corneum. So the life history of a keratinocyte. It starts out, that cell type starts out being produced by the stem cells in the stratum basal. Remember that our germinal layer is where we produce new keratinocytes, and that germinal layer is the stratum basal. So those new cells push towards others at the surface, and as they get closer to the surface, they grow flat and fill with vesicles. The cells are filled with keratin, and that forms a water barrier. So this prevents water from getting out. It also prevents nutrients from getting to the cells that are more superficial than the stratum granulosum. When these cells are cut off from the nutrient and water supply, the cells die and eventually exfoliate or slough off of the body. Our next layer is the dermis. The dermis is between 0.6 millimeters and 3 millimeters thick, so it's fairly thin. The composition of the dermis is mostly collagen and elastic fibers and fibroblasts. Remember, fibroblasts are the building cells of connective tissue. The dermal papillae are extensions of the dermis that reach into the epidermis. So you can see the dermal papillae right here. And they're going to make up the papillary layer of the dermis. In the dermis, we find flexure lines. So these are folds in the dermis at or near joints. So if you look at your hands and you see all those lines in your hands, those are actually indentations in the dermis that the epidermis covers, and they are going to be near joints where the skin frequently is folded. So we have the papillary layer, which I already pointed out, and then our reticular layer, which contains reticular connective tissue. The specific type is dense irregular connective tissue. Our final layer of the skin is the hypodermis. This is also called the subcutaneous tissue or superficial fascia. If you can remember that hypo means low, this is the lowest or deepest layer of our integumentary system. This is mostly composed of adipose tissue, and it functions as an energy reservoir. So adipose tissue stores fat, and fat is a very good source of energy. So when we need extra energy to make more ATP, we can take it out of this subcutaneous adipose tissue. It also functions as thermal insulation. So the hypodermis works like a coat. If you put on a coat, it will make you warmer. But if you have the coat all by itself, it doesn't produce any heat. It just helps to trap the heat that's made by your body. So the hypodermis will trap heat made by your body, but it doesn't actually make heat itself. And finally, the hypodermis is a handy spot to inject things. So oftentimes we'll have a subcutaneous or hypodermic injection. And the reason we inject things here is because it is highly vascular, and the blood vessels pick up that substance that we've injected and quickly take it to the whole body. Now that you've been introduced to the basic structures and layers of the skin, we'll start talking about some of the accessory structures that are associated with the skin and pigments and coloration of the skin.